History books love to tell us about mighty kings, emperors, and sultans who shaped the world through their power. They show us their battles, their crowns, their palaces, and their laws. But what they rarely reveal is that some of the most important decisions made by these rulers were not whispered in the halls of council. They were whispered in private chambers behind silk curtains by women who were never meant to be remembered. These women were not queens by birth. They were not princesses raised in castles. Many of them began their lives as slaves, captured in wars, stolen from villages, or bought in markets. They were taken from their families, stripped of their names, and thrown into the service of kings. Yet despite the chains that bound them, some of these women would rise so high that they bent kings to their will. To understand how this was possible, we need to step into the hidden world of royal harems and secret courts. The harem was often described as a prison, filled with hundreds of women competing for the attention of a ruler. But within this prison, a handful of women learned to survive, and more than that, to control. They understood that a king's weakness was not found on the battlefield, but in his heart and his desires. One of the earliest examples comes from the Abbasid Caliphate. A young slave girl named Khazran was brought into the court as nothing more than a concubine. Yet she possessed sharp intelligence, political skill, and an unshakable will. In time, she became the favorite of Caliph al-Mahdi. He trusted her so deeply that he allowed her to influence matters of state. She convinced him to name her sons as heirs, shaping the entire future of the empire. This was not love alone, it was strategy, and it worked. But Khazran's story was just the beginning. Across centuries and empires, from Baghdad to Istanbul to Beijing, slave girls found ways to transform their captivity into power. They learned how to listen, how to speak, how to advise, and most importantly, how to control kings who believed themselves untouchable. This is the hidden story that royal chronicles tried to bury. Because if kings were shown to be ruled by slaves, the image of their absolute authority would shatter. Yet behind the walls of palaces, that is exactly what happened. And as we pull back those curtains of history, one question becomes unavoidable. How did these women, stripped of freedom, end up controlling the men who claimed to control the world? In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power. Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent, ruled lands stretching across 3 continents. His armies terrified Europe, his navy dominated the seas, and his palace in Istanbul dazzled with gold, marble, and silks. To outsiders, Suleiman looked like the ultimate ruler, untouchable, unchallenged, supreme. But deep inside the Topkapi Palace, power was slipping into unexpected hands. Her name was Roxolana, though the Ottomans called her Harem Sultan. She was not a noblewoman, nor the daughter of a dynasty. She was a slave girl, captured from Eastern Europe and thrown into the vast Ottoman harem, a place filled with hundreds of women competing for the Sultaness' attention. At first, Roxolana was just another face in the crowd, yet she possessed a rare combination of beauty, wit, and intelligence. Unlike many who sought only favor or gifts, Roxolana studied the palace carefully. She observed the Sultan's moods, his weaknesses, his ambitions. Slowly, she began to rise. Suleiman noticed her laughter, her clever words, her ability to calm him when politics grew tense. Soon, she was no longer just a concubine. She became his favorite. But Roxolana was not content with luxury alone. She understood something dangerous. The harem was not only about pleasure, it was a battlefield of influence. In a move that shocked the Ottoman world, Suleiman broke tradition and made Roxolana his legal wife. For centuries, sultans had avoided marriage to keep themselves free from political alliances, but Suleiman shattered that rule for her. With marriage came legitimacy, and with legitimacy came power. Roxolana began to advise him on matters of state. Now, letters between them reveal her role in shaping policy, diplomacy, and even the succession of heirs. She secured positions for her allies, removed her rivals, and ensured her children would inherit the throne. In whispers and private conversations, she steered the empire's direction. To the world, Suleiman remained the Magnificent, but to those within the palace, it became clear he was no longer ruling alone. A former slave girl, once nameless and powerless, had captured not only his heart but also the empire itself. Her rise sent shockwaves through the Ottoman elite. Nobles resented her influence, clerics questioned her power, and rivals feared her cunning. Yet Suleiman refused to let her go. Roxolana had turned captivity into control, proving that even the strongest king could be ruled from behind a curtain. And she was not alone. Across history, other slave women would follow similar paths, turning chains into crowns. Some would rule openly, others from the shadows. But perhaps the most feared of them all was a woman who rose not just to influence kings, but to rule as a queen mother over an entire empire. If Roxolana broke the rules of the Ottoman court, then Kaiksem Sultan rewrote them entirely. Her story is one of the most extraordinary in history, a tale of a slave girl who rose so high that she effectively ruled the Ottoman Empire for decades. Born around 1589, Kaiksem was a Greek girl captured and sold into slavery. She entered the harem of Sultan Ahmed I, one of the empire's most powerful rulers. At first, she was just another concubine, expected to serve and obey. But Kaiksem had a sharp mind, patience, and a gift for strategy. Within a few years, she became Ahmed's favorite, and eventually his wife. When Ahmed died young, most expected case, influence to end. Instead, it grew stronger. Her young sons and later her grandsons inherited the throne, but they were too young or too weak to rule alone. Kaiksem stepped into the vacuum. As valid sultan, or queen mother, she became regent, the official guardian of the throne. From behind palace walls, she directed armies, approved treaties, and decided who lived or died in court politics. She negotiated with foreign ambassadors, controlled the treasury, and placed loyal allies in high offices. Her word carried more weight than generals or ministers. For more than 30 years, Kaiksem shaped the destiny of one of the greatest empires in the world. But her power came at a cost. The palace was a nest of conspiracies, and Kaiksem made dangerous enemies. When her grandson Mehmed IV came to the throne, his mother Kaisem's daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, saw her as a rival. A deadly struggle began between the two women. In 1651, that struggle ended in blood. One night, assassins loyal to Turhan entered Kaisem's chambers. Despite her age, Kaiksem fought back fiercely, but she was overpowered and strangled with a curtain. The woman who had ruled empires from the shadows died as she had once lived inside the secret world of the harem. Yet Kaisem's legacy remained. She had been a slave girl, stolen from her homeland. But through intelligence, patience, and cunning, she had ruled as powerfully as any king. In Ottoman history, she is remembered as one of the most influential figures of all time. Her story shows us the unsettling truth. While kings wore the crowns, it was often the women beside them. Women's society tried to erase who held the real power. But the Ottomans were not the only empire where slave girls rose from nothing to control rulers. In the Abbasid Caliphate, another woman would carve out a path to power, using her voice, her wit, and her children to shape the future of a dynasty. Long before the Ottoman harems, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was the beating heart of the Islamic world. Its caliphs were seen as the successors to the Prophet, leaders of a vast empire that stretched across continents. They commanded armies, scholars, poets, and treasures. Yet even in this world of unmatched power, a slave girl managed to bend the course of history. Her name was Khazuran. Khazuran was born far from Baghdad, likely in Yemen, and sold into slavery at a young age. She was brought to the court of Caliph al-Mahdi as just another concubine. In a palace where hundreds of women vied for the caliph's attention, her chances of standing out were slim. Khazuran was no ordinary slave. She was intelligent, sharp-tongued, and politically aware. Unlike many concubines, Khazuran did not rely only on beauty. She listened to conversations about governance, studied the weaknesses of court rivals, and positioned herself as more than a companion. She became an advisor. Al-Mahdi trusted her judgment, often allowing her voice to influence political appointments and major decisions. Slowly, her whispers in private chambers began shaping the empire itself. But Khazuran's real power came through her sons. She convinced al-Mahdi to name them as heirs, setting in motion a dynasty that would alter the future of the Abbasids. When her son Musa al-Hadi became caliph, Khazuran did not fade into the background. She demanded a role in governance, attending meetings, making decisions, and at times overruling men who believed women had no place in power. Her influence caused tension. Musa al-Hadi grew resentful, trying to push her aside, but Khazuran was too entrenched in the palace to be silenced. When he died suddenly, some whispered by poison, her second son Harun ar-Rashid became caliph. Under his rule, Khazuran's authority flourished. She became a queen mother in all, but name with the ability to appoint officials, distribute wealth, and control court politics. What makes her story so striking is that Khazuran began as property, a woman without freedom, status, or family. Yet she transformed herself into one of the most powerful figures of the Abbasid Empire. Her intelligence and persistence shattered the barriers that had been built to keep women invisible. The chronicles of Baghdad tried to downplay her role, but her influence was undeniable. Behind the throne of mighty caliphs, Khazuran steered an empire, and she was not the last. From Baghdad to Cairo, other slave women would rise to similar heights, some remembered only in whispers. One of the most fascinating lived in the courts of the Mamluk sultans, a woman whose story shows how even in a system built entirely on military slavery, it was sometimes the slave women who pulled the strings. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was a world built on slavery. Its rulers were themselves former slaves, trained as soldiers, who rose to power through sheer force and loyalty to the system. But inside their palaces, another kind of slavery existed, one that shaped politics just as powerfully as the armies outside. Koan Togay was one such woman. She began her life as a slave concubine in the court of Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, one of the longest-reigning rulers of the Mamluk dynasty in the 14th century. Like so many others, she entered the palace as property, expected only to serve and remain silent. Yet Togay's story would end very differently. Al-Nasir was captivated by her intelligence and charm. Over time, his affection for her grew so strong that he freed her from slavery and elevated her to the status of wife. This act was unusual and dangerous. To free a slave woman and make her queen was not only a break from custom, it was a signal that she was now more than a companion. She was a partner in rule. Once she became Khawand, a title meaning lady, Togay's influence in court politics deepened. She became a trusted counselor to al-Nasir, whispering advice on appointments, alliances, and palace intrigues. She gathered her own circle of supporters, securing loyalty through gifts, favors, and patronage. Her rivals in court, noble-born women and ambitious emirs, found themselves pushed aside by a woman who had once been nothing more than a servant. The chronicles describe her as a figure of grace and strength, able to move the sultan with words when soldiers and advisors failed. Some accused her of manipulating him, others of protecting him from plots. Either way, her hand was present in the rise and fall of powerful men around the throne. Her life was proof of a paradox that haunted the Mamluk world. While the empire was built on military slaves who seized thrones with their swords, some of the most subtle but decisive power was exercised by enslaved women who never stepped onto the battlefield. Koan Togay. Rise also reveals a hidden truth of royal courts. Freedom and influence were not always granted by birth or title. Sometimes they were seized by intelligence, patience, and the ability to bend the heart of a king. In another empire to the east, a servant girl would rise so high that she wore the robes of a ruler, advised kings openly, and blurred the line between concubine and sovereign. In the southern Tang dynasty of 10th century China, the imperial palace was a place of strict order and rigid hierarchy. At the very bottom of that system were the servant girls, young women brought in to cook, clean, or wait on the royals. They were not expected to have a voice, let alone power. Yet from this world of silence, a servant girl named Lu Chongxian rose to heights no one imagined. Lu Chongxian began her life as a maid in the palace of Emperor Liu, a ruler celebrated for his poetry but criticized for his political weakness. Most nobles, she was invisible, just another girl among hundreds. But her sharp mind and calm presence caught the emperor's attention. Where ministers and generals argued, she listened. Where others pressed their ambitions, she offered quiet but piercing insight. Soon Li began to lean on her for advice. What started as private conversations turned into consultations on matters of state. Court officials were shocked to see the emperor treating a maid as if she were a minister. Or had he discovered a new kind of wisdom in the most unlikely of places? Lu Chongxian's role grew. She was seen wearing fine robes, walking not as a servant but as a consort. She gained the emperor's trust so fully that some records suggest she influenced his decisions during the Tang-esque conflicts with the rising Song dynasty. She spoke not just about court intrigues, but about diplomacy, alliances, and threats to the kingdom. Her presence enraged the aristocrats who viewed her as an upstart, a woman of low birth who dared to speak on matters reserved for nobles and scholars. They tried to discredit her, to remind the emperor of her origins. Yet Li Yu continued to seek her counsel. To him she was not a maid, but a voice he trusted more than his ministers. In time, she was no longer seen as a servant, but as a figure almost queenly in status. She blurred the lines between slave, consort, and advisor. Though she never officially ruled, her words shaped policies and influenced a king's hand at one of the most fragile moments in the dynasty's history. Lu Changxian's story is a reminder of how fragile power structures really were. A girl with no title, no wealth, and no family name could climb to the top of the palace walls, not by rebellion or war, but by the force of her mind. But the hidden history of slave women did not always end in influence. In some courts, these women became victims of jealousy, pawns in deadly struggles, or scapegoats for failed rulers. And in one of the most brutal examples, the slave girls who rose too high became the first to fall when dynasties collapsed. As much as slave girls could rise in power, they also lived on the edge of ruin. Their fate depended on the king's favor, and when that favor vanished, so did their safety. History is filled with cases where these women, once praised as trusted companions, were later branded as enemies of the state. In medieval courts, kings who faced failure often searched for someone to blame. Ministers risked revolt if accused. Generals had armies at their backs. But the slave girl, powerless in law, without allies, stripped of her birth family, became the easiest target. Her very rise made her dangerous, for she could be accused of manipulating the king, of seduction, of witchcraft. Take the Ottoman harem as an example. Women like Roxolana had risen from slavery to queenly authority, shaping empire-wide politics. Yet others, less fortunate, fell victim to jealous rivals and angry courtiers. A king's mistress who once dined at his table could be strangled with a silk cord the very next day. To the outside world, her name vanished, her memory erased, as if her influence had never existed. The same pattern can be seen in China. Lu Changxian, who once whispered statecraft into Li Yu's ear, became a lightning rod for resentment. When the southern temps fell to the Song dynasty, her power evaporated. What had once been praised as cleverness was now denounced as meddling. Records hint that she suffered humiliation in captivity, a reminder that the higher she had climbed, the harder her fall. This was the paradox of power for slave girls. They could steer the fate of kings, even empires, yet they held no shield when fortune turned against them. The very men who trusted them most could, in an instant, condemn them as dangerous temptresses who had led the crown astray. Behind closed doors, kings enjoyed their company and sought their wisdom. But in public, when defeat came, the women became convenient scapegoats. By blaming them, rulers protected their own reputation. They could tell the world it was not my failure, it was the slave who bewitched me. This hypocrisy reveals the cruelty of power. These women, who had risen beyond the limits of their station, carried the burden of being both indispensable and disposable. Their influence was undeniable. But it came at the cost of walking a knife's edge. Loved one day, feared the next, erased forever after their fall. And yet, even after such tragedies, their stories refused to die. In whispers, in hidden chronicles, in rare surviving records, tales of slave girls who controlled kings lived on. Their memory haunted palaces and shaped how future rulers treated the women who served them. But their story doesn't end with downfall. In some courts, slave women turned survival itself into a weapon, building hidden networks, controlling information, and influencing history in ways that kings never saw coming. If there is one truth history shows us, it is this: no ruler, no matter how powerful, can rule alone. Then in the shadows of royal courts, the slave girls learned this lesson well. Individually they were vulnerable, but together they created invisible webs of influence that stretched across entire kingdoms. In the Ottoman Empire, The harem was not simply a place of pleasure. It was a political machine where slave women exchanged secrets, formed alliances, and passed information from one chamber to another. A whisper at night could reach the ears of the Grand Vizier by morning. Servants who brought food or tended to clothes often carried messages more dangerous than any weapon. Some women rose to the top by navigating this hidden network. A slave girl might secure a place close to the king, but her survival depended on the support of other women. Allies who could warn her of rivals, or who could carry her words beyond the locked walls of the palace. In China's Forbidden City, this was especially true. Palace maids and slave consorts formed silent sisterhoods, sharing information about the emperor's moods, the plans of ministers, and the rivalries between princes. Together, they could steer the emperor's favor toward certain policies or away from dangerous advisors. Their cooperation gave them a power that was almost invisible to the men who thought they controlled the palace. But these networks were not always built on loyalty. Jealousy and fear poisoned them as often as friendship. Slave girls could betray each other to climb higher, feeding rivals to the wrath of jealous queens or suspicious kings. Yet even betrayal proved the same point. The women were never truly powerless. Every move, every secret, every whisper in the night shaped the balance of power in ways historians still struggle to trace. Some rulers even feared these networks. In certain kingdoms, kings forbade servants from speaking to one another in private. Punishments were harsh for those accused of conspiring. Yet these restrictions only proved how dangerous kings believed them to be. When even the most powerful monarchs feared the quiet conversations of slave girls, it showed that the real strength of empires sometimes rested not on armies or gold, but on those unseen voices behind palace walls. The story of these networks reveals a chilling truth. While kings wore crowns, their decisions were often guided by whispers from the very women they claimed to own. And in moments of crisis, those whispers could mean the survival or collapse of a throne. But what became of these women when the walls finally crumbled? What legacy did their hidden power leave behind? To answer that, we must turn to the final chapter, the haunting legacy of slave girls who controlled kings. When we look back at history, the names of kings and emperors dominate the records. Their victories are carved in stone, their failures buried in excuses. But hidden in the shadows are the forgotten women, slave girls who shaped those rulers' choices, whispered into their ears, and sometimes held more sway than armies or ministers. Their legacy is both tragic and powerful. On one hand, most of them were denied recognition. They were written out of official records, their names erased by jealous rivals or fearful dynasties. Yet the traces remain, chronicles that hint at a servant advising a ruler, poems that reveal the hand of a mysterious consort, letters that speak of a woman's unseen influence. These fragments tell us what official history tried to hide, that empires could rise or fall at the hands of women no one was meant to remember. The story of Roxolana, once a slave girl, reminds us how a woman could become queen and alter the fate of the Ottoman Empire. The tale of Lu Changxian shows how a palace maid could command the trust of an emperor only to fall with his dynasty. And behind them, countless others, unnamed, played their roles in silence, never recorded but never without impact. But their legacy is more than personal stories. It reveals something darker about power itself. The crown may sit on the head of a king, but the crown is never truly alone. Power is always influenced, bent, and sometimes controlled by those in the shadows. Slave girls, forced into palaces against their will, discovered ways to survive and even thrive. In doing so, they left behind a history of resistance hidden within submission, of strength found within weakness. And this legacy continues to haunt us. Modern scholars still uncover evidence of these women, women who should have been forgotten, but whose stories refuse to die. Their lives remind us that history is never just about the rulers we are taught to admire. It is also about the silenced voices that shaped them. The hidden story of slave girls who controlled kings is not just about the past. It is a warning about how power really works, who holds it, who hides it, and who history tries to erase. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes the most powerful people in history were the ones no one was supposed to see.